All right, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Tat2d Preacher podcast. This is episode 15. Now, I gotta be honest, it has been a while since I've uploaded a new podcast and actually recorded one. I uploaded one, I think episode 14 was maybe a month and a half ago, but I had recorded that a few months ago. So it's been like three and a half months since I've actually uploaded a fresh podcast, and I hate that. It bothers me that I haven't been consistent, but full transparency, I mean, a lot's happened the last few months in my world, and honestly figuring this podcast stuff out and trying to balance that with everything else in life is hard, and so it is what it is, but I do want to become more consistent. I would love to post weekly. And so that's the goal. That's the intention. And so I want to become more consistent. And so thanks for all of you who have hung in there. I promise I will do better. Well, in this episode, what I want to talk about is I've seen so much stuff in social media, from politics to cultural things to unseen realm stuff, and there's been just a number of videos that have just rocked me and have shook me to my core. So what I want to do in this video is to just mention them at the top, kind of rant about them, verbally process it, but then talk about how we can approach these from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective. Like yes, the world's gone crazy, it's gone chaotic, but like, what can we do as Christians to deal with it? So I want to just walk through just some ways that I process this stuff and make sense of it, because there's just some shocking stuff out there. So that's kind of what I want to do in this episode. But before we get there, I do want to just ask that if you haven't already followed me on social media, to do so. I mean, those of you who post regularly on social media, you know that the algorithm's a bit crazy. Sometimes it loves you and sometimes it hates you. Well, right now I'm in a bit of a desert season with the algorithm. And so if you enjoy my content, and you could go to my Instagram and my YouTube and my TikTok at the handle, the Tat2d Preacher. It's in the description below. And follow me, subscribe to my channel, and just engage with the content, that we can help change that algorithm, help me put me back on the map, if you will. That would mean so much to me, help me out a lot. So if you could do that, you can pause the podcast right now. You can go over, quickly add me, and then come back and finish the podcast. That'd be awesome. And also, I know I haven't posted tons in a while, especially podcasts, but if you could leave me a 5-star review on this podcast, that would, again, help me just get the podcast that I do put out into the podcast land. So that's what I wanted to say off the top. But thanks so much for everyone who does support me. Thanks for all the messages. Thanks for all the engagement that those of you do already. But if you're listening to this and you haven't yet, if you could do that, that'd be amazing. But that's it for now. That's my social media plug. So sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 15. Okay, so as I mentioned, man, I've seen a lot of crazy videos, like things that I never thought I would ever see in my life. Just shockingly disturbing and mind-numbing, and just videos that just make you speechless. And so here are a few of them that have just rocked me, and that's kind of, again, spurred on the purpose for this particular episode. So the first one that I saw, and again, I mean, this is probably, I'm recording this July 15th, so I think this came out maybe a month and a bit ago. So I've kind of compiled a few of them since, again, I haven't posted a lot, but And it was a video of, I believe it was over in Israel, and because June was Pride Month. I think it's Pride Month globally. And they were in Israel and they were raising the pride flag along with the Israel flag at the same time. I think it was in Jerusalem. And I saw that and it was just like, what? Like, you look at the Bible and Israel is God's chosen people, the nation that he chose to bring Jesus through. And this is the kind of stuff that they're doing, acknowledging, representing. And so, man, I saw that and that flag went up with the Israeli flag. And it's just like, that was brutal. Then someone had sent me an article from the UN. And the article was talking about legalizing sex between adults and kids. And this is not a joke. Where I can't remember who it was, but someone high up in the United Nations was talking about how the age of consent should be lowered and that sex between adults and kids should be seen more as normal. And that just basically setting the stage for pedophilia to become normalized. And I had heard this kind of stuff, being like rumored a few years ago, but never thought that we actually get to the place where it's becoming normal. And the UN put that out. And if the UN's putting that out, then it's like the first step, and it's gonna spread like wildfire. This whole normalizing of pedophilia. And then I've even heard recently how there's actually a term that they want to go by. It's like I forget the acronym, but minor persons attracted or something like that, and how they want to become part of the LGBTQ plus movement. They want to have their own little letter at the end of that. Man, like it's insanity. It's mind blowing, shocking. And so then the third video, kind of along the same lines or in the same vein, is there was a trans activist who is a biological male, but he's trans woman, and he wants to be the first trans woman to receive a uterus and ovary transplant so that he can abort a baby. Like that is, I did a slight reaction to this on my Instagram, and it was like, I was just basically saying, like, this has to be the bottom. Like, how can you go lower than this? How can you get darker than this? That some person wants to receive this implant so that they can just abort the baby, be a first person to, like, how is that something to aspire to? But like, this is our culture. They want to aspire to be that. This insanity. And like that, man, that rocked me. It's like, forget the fact that there's been millions of aborted babies over the last few decades. And thank goodness the Roe v. Wade thing was reversed last year. But the fact that someone wants to aspire to accomplish this feat of being the first trans person to abort, first trans woman to abort a baby, if that's not demonic and satanic, I don't know what is. But that one, man, that's brutal. And then I saw another video, and this is, if you've listened to a few of my earlier podcasts, I've referenced Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God, the angels, came down and mated with human women, right? And created the Nephilim, these hybrid, half human, half divine. But when you actually study extra biblical texts, they didn't just intermingle with humans, they intermingled with animals, and then they began to play with the genetic code of different species and mix them together and all this stuff. And then so I saw this video where they're creating robot animal hybrids right now, and they've done this. And man, this is Genesis 6 playing out. And so when you see something like this, you remember what Jesus said in Matthew, that so it was, or as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. And this is the kind of stuff that was happening in the days of Noah. This mixing of different species and playing with genetics, and man, this is dangerous stuff, and it's happening right now. It's crazy. And then there was this. Then the last video I'm gonna reference was a pastor and quote unquote pastor praying what they defined as the Sparkle Creed behind a pulpit, and they led their congregation in this like demonic prayer to not the God of the Bible. They referred to God as non-binary. They refer to Jesus as the son of the non-binary God. It was it was like so ridiculous. It was humorous, but at the same time, it's like they're praying to demons. They're praying to false gods. They're praying to entities, and they're all opening themselves up in church, in unison, collectively reciting this creed, the Sparkle Creed. And there's a pretty big church, and this is just a few of the plethora of stuff that's out there right now, just showing how crazy, how chaotic, how just nuts our culture is, just how nuts it is. And so it's rocked me, it's bothered me. It honestly, it keeps me up, because it's like when you start going down this road of like actually becoming aware of where things are at, and not just kind of putting your head in the sand and pretending like everything is fine. Because like I did that for a lot of years when I was in ministry. I didn't care about culture. I didn't care about what was going on. I just basically just, didn't concern myself with basically things outside of the little bubble that I had created. But when you actually get your head in the sand and take a look around at and see what's going on, man, like it bothers me. It shakes me. I feel so concerned for people, for humanity, for the church, because there's so much deception out there. And I think that there's just so much stuff that's happening that people are just oblivious to, and people are just being so influenced that they don't even realize it. And so it's kind of put me, I did a YouTube video about this back in beginning of July, just basically talking about how as Christians we can become so naive to actually what's going on, and how for me I feel like sometimes I'm caught in the middle, and I feel like there's the church world, and then there's the culture, and the church sometimes is so far removed from culture and actually what's going on, and naive, and it's like I'm trying to figure out a way to bridge that gap, and so sometimes I feel overwhelmed. And so what can we do as Christians? Like, how do we process this kind of stuff? How do we process our culture? How do we process these videos? How do we process the fact of the UN wanting to legalize adult and child sexual union as normal? How do we process that as Christians? Like, what do we do? How do we process Genesis 6 stuff happening, genetic modifications, the commingling of species? How do we process trans activists who wants to be the first trans woman to receive a transplant so that they can have a baby and abort it? Like, what do you do with that from a biblical perspective? How do we keep ourselves from becoming deceived? How do we keep ourselves from succumbing to this atmosphere of just junk that's out there, while not being naive and putting our head in the sand? How do we make a difference? And so that's kind of what I want to look at for the rest of this podcast. And I just want to talk about the hierarchy of influence, because of how these kind of things become so normal. how our culture has just embraced this way of thinking, how it's become so anti-God. Like, how did we get here? And so I just want to talk about this hierarchy of influence, and it's how I process this, how I think about it, how at least I can get to a place where, even though I fully don't understand it, at least it somewhat makes sense. And so that's what I want to do now. I've kind of broken this down into different levels, right? And so level one of how our culture has become so influenced, and like what's been the pattern. And so level one, Satan, the devil. Now, clearly the Bible is very clear on the reality, the existence of Satan, of the devil. At some point, he was in heaven. He was with God. He was around the throne. And I mean, I'm not going to get into a whole deep dive into Satan. That's a whole different podcast for a different day. But basically, he was by God's throne. He had influence. And at some point, pride filled his heart. There was a rebellion in heaven. We don't know. The Bible doesn't talk about when this happened or how it happened, but it did happen. And I know some of you will go Revelation 12 and the devil fell with a third of the angels. That's not talking about some big rebellion, but I addressed that in a different podcast. I think podcast episode 11 or 12. So go back and check that out. But at some point there was this massive rebellion and he fell, took a lot of divine beings in heaven with him. And basically he is the essence of everything that's anti-God. So everything that we see in our culture from a macro level, everything that's demonic, everything that's evil, everything that's wicked, everything that is anti-God has his fingerprint on it. He's contaminated everything. His influence on the divine realm and on our physical realm, and his deception, being the father of lies, has just infiltrated and influenced everything. All right. So again, I mean, this isn't rocket science. I'm sure a lot of you watching this right now or listening to this, that makes sense. You could be like, oh, well, obviously, Joel, like obviously the devil. But it's important to address that and to just mentally have it at the forefront, knowing, okay, as Ephesians says, he's the God of this world. And right now, God has let him run loose with limitations, but has allowed him to work and act and influence our world. And so he is the one that has pushed out everything that's anti-God, and he's influenced everything. So you have Satan, and then I guess level 2 in this hierarchy is territorial entities. And I've addressed this again in previous episodes. I did a whole episode on territorial entities, but this is where there are, over each nation, over each region, over each city, over each country, like there are divine beings that have the power and the capacity to influence everything that happens there. And so we see in Deuteronomy 32, one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Michael Heiser, calls it the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Remember at Babel when God dispersed all the people that had congregated, building that tower, and he separated them all and confused their languages. In Deuteronomy 32, we also read that God then, he separated all the nations according to the number of the sons of God. And so every nation, he assigned a divine entity, a divine being to oversee as a partial judgment. Because remember what God told to Noah and his sons, you'll be fruitful and multiply after the flood, fill the earth and subdue it. But they all didn't listen. They all congregated at Babel, rebelled against God. And so as a form of judgment, God dispersed them all. And for a time, he put all the nations under divine beings. And he was going to start his own nation. And this is when God calls Abram, which becomes Abraham, and the nation of Israel is born. But for a time, he put all these nations under his heavenly sons. And then we see in Psalm 82 that these sons of God who were supposed to rule and oversee these nations, they became corrupt. They began to receive worship for themselves. They began to basically govern and rule in the complete opposite way that God wanted them to govern and rule. They became corrupt and wicked and, punishing the good, allowing the evil to thrive, just completely butchering it. And so Psalm 82 is God's judgment on those sons of God who were overseeing the nations. And then in Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul picks up on that language. And so we see these terms like dominions, thrones, principalities, powers, rulers, all these are all geographical terms for divine entity rulership. And so what we gather from all of this is the fact that over nations, over regions, over cities, there are divine beings, there are principalities, there are entities at play that are working to influence people in ungodly ways. So you have Satan, who's influencing everything, every realm. And then you have these territorial entities who are governing and ruling and who are influencing and who are, causing the atmosphere literally in the spirit realm or in the supernatural realm, however you want to phrase that, who are contaminating regions, cities, and nations. The thinking, the behavior, every part of society is being affected by them. It's the air that we breathe, and people don't realize it. I mean, just think about that for a second. Right now, over nations, over cities, over regions, that there's a spiritual war happening. There are real beings, real entities at play, seeking to influence, seeking to corrupt, seeking to cause people to just get caught up in junk, manipulate people into believing stuff. And I mean, you can see where culture is gone, where society is gone. Like the things that are seen as normal that are just completely twisted. It's because we've been so influenced. There's an agenda out there, a divine agenda, and it's real. In 1 John, he talks about the spirit of the Antichrist. That right now, like in the spirit realm, there is an Antichrist agenda being pushed out all over the globe, in every culture, in language, and tribe, and in their own context. But that agenda is being pushed out, and it manifests in different ways depending on where they are and the context of that place. But it's real. So you have Satan, you have the territorial entities at play, and then the third kind of level that I think really helps push this influence along and brings it down to our everyday is, for lack of a better term, I called it the occultic agenda. And again, this is a whole other deep dive in and of itself, but there are many different satanic factions and groups and societies out there that are involved in some of the most dangerous and sick and demonic practices, rituals that are thousands of years old, that have been going on for millennia. But these different groups and societies are involved in these practices, and what they're doing is they're creating openings for beings and entities that live in the unseen realm to then come into our space and then influence the masses. And I know this may sound like crazy to some people or unbelievable or conspiratorial or whatever, But when you actually spend the time to dive in and investigate, and I mean, there are, for hundreds and thousands of years, secret societies, satanic groups, occultic groups that practice high levels of witchcraft, that get involved with rituals and sacrifices, and these that basically create openings, spiritual gates, portals, or however you want to call that these demonic entities, then these beings, can then travel through into our space, because he's created boundaries. There are rules of engagement, if you will. If you're in the unseen realm, the spiritual world, there's things that they only can do, but they're not allowed to come into our world and transgress which is why Genesis 6, God judged them so hard, so ruthlessly, because they transgressed the boundary of supernatural or spiritual and physical. They left their domain, as Peter says, and they came into our realm, and then they mated with human women. They transgressed the boundaries that God had established. So there are boundaries and there are rules. But when people engage in these demonic practices, and there's so many groups, and that's a massive topic in and of themselves. But when they engage in this stuff, it creates openings in the supernatural realm and the spirit realm. And it attracts these beings to come in. It attracts these demonic entities to come in that then can actually influence people, influence cultures, influence society, and it's crazy. And I don't think we realize the kind of stuff that is happening all around the world under the umbrella of the occult. I mean, when you start digging into this stuff, I mean, it's enough to make you sick. Like, there's things happening right now. I mean, right now that movie, The Sound of Freedom, all about the sex trafficking of little kids. I mean, that's just one fraction of the stuff that's happening right now. And when you see that movie and you see the stuff that these kids go through, that's just one part of the stuff that if you actually knew what was going on, like, our brains could not comprehend it. And it's like, we are literally living in a spiritual war. And there's so much. And when you have all of these occultic groups creating all these openings, being a part of all this stuff, and again, it happens through music and movies and entertainment. That's why all this stuff, it's all connected. But when you have songs, for example, being written in the environment of a satanic ritual where sacrifices are happening, the song is created and then it gets played out thousands and thousands and thousands of times globally, that there's like demonic presence attached to those songs that influences people. And that's just another example. But this stuff is real, and it's another way that we are influenced. And so you have Satan, you have the territorial entities, you have the occultic agenda that's happening. And then the last level, the fourth level, I just want to call blind humanity. People who are oblivious to what's actually going on, because the majority of people are blind, whether you are a believer or unbeliever. And so if you're unbeliever, people who don't believe in Jesus, they are just open game for the enemy to just head off. There is no resistance. I mean, they're hopeless. There is no way that they cannot not be influenced. There is no protection. There's no Holy Spirit. And so you have unbelievers who, and a lot of these people may be good people, but their eyes have not been opened. And so they're just breathing in, taking in all this stuff, and they're in this spiritual war with zero armor, and they don't even know it. And so that's where you have, I mean, a lot of these videos of these people, they're just unbelievers who have been swept up in the culture that we live in, the air, the satanic air that we are breathing in. And it's no wonder why they participate and why they think the way they think, and they do the things that they do. They have no choice. There's no protection for them. And then you have believers. And the crazy thing about this is you have Christians who either just put their head in the sand and they don't want to think about this stuff. They know stuff on a theological perspective or on an intellectual perspective, but they don't want to actually engage with it. Like, they know about the spiritual war, they know there's the devil, they know that, there's demonic entities. They know this stuff is real, but they just they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to engage with it. So they put their head in the sand. And when you do that, well, you leave yourself open. But then you have other believers, and especially when you look at the stats, who don't read their Bibles or who don't know how to read their Bibles. Massive, massive numbers of church-going people, Christians, who don't read their Bible or don't know how to read their Bible. And so what happens when you have Christians who don't read their Bible, who don't know what God has said, and then you're living in a culture that's anti-God? So you don't know what God said, and you're not engaging with the text. You're not letting God's word renew your mind and your heart and your spirit. You're not filling yourself up with God's truth, but you're living in a world that's, well, it is what it is. How can you not then be affected? And that's why you have Christians, pastors, praying the Sparkle Creed. Like, what? You got people praying along with the pastor because they don't know. You got Christians who are getting caught up in false doctrine, getting influenced by false teachers. Why? Because they don't know the Bible for themselves. They don't know what God's actually said, so they just take the words of other people because it may sound good, may sound right, and they're like, oh, they just eat it up. Or you have churches with pastors that are too afraid to speak the truth, too afraid to stand up and actually speak what's right, even if it goes against culture, even though there may be penalties, even though there may be consequences to doing so, but they don't. Which then leads to whole churches then just becoming deceived. Churches swallowing the poison. Churches that are becoming more influenced by the culture than the reverse. It should be church influencing the culture, but instead the culture's been influencing the church. And that's a cliche statement, but it's actually where we're at. So many churches, so many pastors, so many believers have been influenced by the culture, and they've been either too afraid to stand up, or they've just been deceived into believing false teaching, false doctrine. And because they're so biblically illiterate, they don't even know it. And so that's the 4 levels. So we see where we're at. And you have Satan again, level 1, the master influencer. You have territorial entities. And we see that all throughout the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, influencing. And then you have the occultic agenda that, again, is comprised of so many different things. It's not just Satanism, but you have all the false religions, all the false teaching. You got atheism in there. You got all that stuff, occultic agendas, because it's all demonic in nature. And then you have blind humanity, believers and unbelievers alike, who don't know the truth, don't know what the Bible says, have no spiritual protection, and who've allowed themselves to become influenced and are just up there oblivious to it. And you put all of that together, then when you see these videos, you see the stuff that gets circulated, you see the condition of some of the churches, you see the condition of just our culture, well, then it makes sense. It's easy to see how you get to where we're at, how backwards, upside down things are. That's why we need Jesus. That's why our relationship with Jesus has to be the most important thing. That's why understanding what the Bible says, learning how to read the Bible properly, spending time with God and His Word is not just important because it's what Christians are supposed to do, but it's literally the anchor. It's literally the guide. It's literally the only way to navigate our way through this mess that we see ourselves. God's word is the one thing is over and over being assaulted. It's why you have these quote unquote churches and pastors trying to twist the scriptures, pervert the scriptures, take things out of context. You have scholars, secular scholars and theologians who go out of their way to try to rip the Bible of its authoritative power, of its inerrancy, do everything that they can possibly do to strip the Bible of its divine essence. That's the agenda. Because they know, the enemy knows, the Bible is alive and active, that it's God-breathed. I just saw a video today from this dude, man. He's all over TikTok. Comes across, he's some professor, scholar, but he's liberal and he's not a Christian, but he goes out of his way to basically strip the Bible of anything evangelical, if you will. And he did a video today where he starts it off where he goes, if you believe in 2 Timothy 3:16, here's why you shouldn't, which is the verse about how the Bible is God-breathed. And he's a biblical scholar. Dude gets hundreds of thousands of views on his stuff. And I read through his videos and I see his comments, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people being led astray. And it's like, man, but a lot of his stuff, you listen to it, and if you're not careful, it's very easy to then become deceived by it, to start or to start questioning what you actually were taught, to start questioning the things that you know to be true. And so when we're not engaged with God and His Word, when that's not part of our lives, if we are lazy with our spiritual growth, if we are lazy in our relationship with God, if we are lazy in our fellowship with fellow believers, if we are lazy and not passionate and not engaged, we open up ourselves to be ineffective Christians, an ineffective church that end up becoming deceived if we're not careful. And so that's my takeaway to all of this. It's just like, I see all this stuff. I see where we're at. And I'm just like, man, I got to know God more. I got to pursue Him more. I feel like just seeing where everything is at, it pushes me closer to Him. Because if not, it's like, man, it's dangerous. It's dangerous out there. This isn't fear-mongering. I'm not trying to be negative, but I've seen so much stuff now. You see this whole deconstructing from Christianity movement that's happened. All these Christians, all these famous worship leaders and leaders in the church walking away from God, or these leaders just adopting false theology now and changing their interpretation of things. And it's just like, it's dangerous out there. And I know so many of us just want to keep our head in the sand and pretend like everything is fine. And man, it's a war. And there are real powers and at play here. There is a real battle for your soul, for your life. And we got to be aware of that. And we got to stay close to Jesus like never before. And so when I see this stuff, that's my conclusion, is I'm no better than anyone else. I'm not special. And if I'm not engaged with Jesus, if I'm not pursuing Him, I have the potential to be deceived just like everybody else. This is real. And so my encouragement to you is stay close to Jesus. Pray for people. Pray for the lost. Ask God to use you in power. Ask God to use your life to influence those around you, to bring the kingdom of God with you everywhere you go. Because we're not left helpless. Yes, it's a battle out there and it's dangerous, but we're not like walking around with our hands behind our back. If we are engaged with Jesus, if we've given Him our life, we are filled with the Spirit, and He's given every Christian a purpose and a destiny and a mission to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cast out devils, to cleanse lepers. He's given us all authority in Him to establish His kingdom on the earth. And so we have the armor of God on. We can be equipped for the battle. So we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to walk around in fear. But we just have to understand that, no, we are actually in a battle that's real. And until we do that, it is dangerous for people. To walk around with no armor, you're just leaving yourself open to getting pegged and taken out. So stay close to Jesus. Make Him your number one priority. Make Him your number one pursuit. Grow in love with Him like you never have before. Get to know Jesus. Well, that's it for episode 15. Thanks so much for all of you for listening and or watching, and for making it all the way to the end, those of you that did. This is just something that I'm passionate about. This topic, this whole discussion is just something that's just on my mind and my heart constantly, and it's important, and I think it needs to be talked about. So yeah, thanks for hanging in there. And as always, leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment in the comment section. If you have any questions, all my contact information, social media, email, all that is in the description below. Go follow me on social media. Leave a sweet review if you haven't already. And yeah, thanks so much for watching and listening. And we'll see you all in episode 16. Much love.